He was the first Liberal leader in more than 120 years to win 3 consecutive elections. This after his political opponents twice tried to convince Ontarians during election campaigns that he, quote, wasn't up to the job. Now, Ontario's 24th Premier has written his memoirs. The new book is called Making a Difference, and we're pleased to welcome Dalton James Patrick McGuinty Jr. back to TVO for a feature interview on his life in and out of politics. Pleasure seeing you again.
Good to see you, Steve.
I guess that's funny, eh? The first thing I learned about the book is that you're not called Dalton when you're growing up, right? You're Jamie.
That's correct. In order to avoid confusion at home, my dad had the same name, right? So my mother called me Jamie, and that stuck. My grandmother called me Jim, and in fact, later on, probably when I was around the age of 12, my father nicknamed me Mick, and I was known as Mick to him.
All those different names.
Yeah.
Here are, for everybody's reminder, some of the highlights of the McGuinty record when you were the Premier of Ontario. We had the creation of the Ontario Health Premium, which came as a result of that first budget. We had the creation of the Greenbelt and protecting those lands there. The creation of the harmonized sales tax. The creation of full-day kindergarten. The McGuinty government helped save General Motors and Chrysler during troubled times. There was the closing of all of Ontario's coal-fired energy generation stations. And, of course, as I alluded to off the top, 3 election victories in 2003, 07, and 2011. Let me start here. Only 25 premiers, and I think only Bob Rae has written his memoirs. It is generally, for some reason, not done. So why did you feel a need to do it?
Well, I've written the book for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I wanted my children and grandchildren to have a personal record of my public life. There are all kinds of public records and narratives that have developed over the years, but the fact of the matter is that people have to infer what I was thinking or speculate as to my motivation. So I thought it was important for them to have that personal record. The other thing, of course, is that I felt a sense of responsibility. I had the privilege to serve Ontarians for an extended period of time in politics. And I learned a lot of lessons in leadership along the way, and I thought it was important to share those with others. We did some really big things in government. We'll take some time, I'm sure, to cover that. I led an activist government. I'm not the kind of leader who chose to passively preside over the evolution of events in Ontario. I thought you should take the bull by the horns and drive change, and that is what I did. So I've shared a number of lessons with people about leadership in the book, Steve. So I think ultimately, I hope that I inspire a few people of whatever political stripe to understand how rewarding politics can be and to find a way to make a difference through politics in their own lives.
A lot of people write memoirs to get even with people. You don't seem to have done much of that in this book. How come?
Oh, but what do I want to get even about? I mean, it's
well, because lots of people took lots of shots at you for a long time.
But it is what it is. And you know, my personal mantra, and I think I reference this in the book, is never too high, never too low, just relentless. And I'm convinced that with the passage of time, during my career and even after my career, people will come to know the real me. And so you're gonna get some glowing reviews, which frankly you didn't deserve. You're gonna take some cheap shots, which you didn't deserve either. But people are gonna come to know you over time.
Speaking of overtime, we are going to spend our time tonight essentially going through the Dalton McGuinty story. And in some respects, I hate like hell to do this to you because I want to start with the worst night of your life. But it's the night that actually allows you to become the politician you became. And you know where I'm going with this. Let's read this excerpt from your book. I got a call from my brother Michael, who was staying with my parents. He yelled into the phone, "Jamie, get the hell over here." I drove over as quickly as I could. On my arrival, I discovered a scene on the back deck I will never forget. My father was lying on his back, and my mother was giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I eased my mother away and took over the artificial respiration. We kept this up while we waited for the ambulance to arrive. When it finally did, and the attendants took my father away on a stretcher, we got in my car and followed on behind to the hospital, where the doctor informed us that my father had passed away from a heart attack. He was 63 years old. Okay, a bunch of stuff to unpack here. Let's start with this kind of odd observation. You are 60 now. You are within 3 years of your father's death.
Right.
Do you ever think about that?
I do, and in part that was the motivation for me to retire from politics and to understand that there's more to life than just politics, as rewarding and as noble a pursuit that is. And I wanted to find a way, ultimately, to spend a bit more time with my family. Steve, you know that to me, the beginning, the middle, and the end is family. And my dad was a powerful influence for good in my life. And as unexpected and as tragic as that loss was for me of my father, and the greatest regret I have about my time in politics is he never saw me get nominated. He never saw me win as my first election or to sit in opposition. He never saw me get elected as leader. He never saw me.
He saw none of it.
He saw none of it, yeah. But in a way, you know, he was there throughout, in the sense that it was his example. You know, one of his favorite lectures at the table was, it was never going to be good enough to grow up and get a job and pay taxes. Everybody does that. You need to find a way to make a difference. So I was proud to carry on the tradition. I can remember a couple of weeks after the funeral, I come home to Terry, I say, "Hannah, I think I got to run." She says, "We've got 4 kids under 8. There's no way you're going to run." And I said, "That's very sensible. But I think I've got to run," and I did.
I want to pick up on that line that you said your father was a force for good in your life, because you are candid enough in the book to say, quote, "I suddenly longed for a closeness with my dad that we never achieved when he was alive." Why didn't you have that?
I think it was in keeping with the generation. And I don't think it was expected that fathers would be that close, as close to their sons as I try to be to my own children today. So he was a little bit removed.
There was 10 of you as well. Maybe that had something to do with
10 of us, yeah. But, you know, I think that, you know, he was expected to kind of, in a sense, rule both with an iron hand and keep us out of mischief and focused on all of the wonderful McGuinty exploits that I talk about in the book. But I think that he never really, in a sense, let his guard down. He never really was as open as I would have liked to have him be. But, you know, he was the best dad that he could be, and I was very lucky to have him.
Best dad he could be, but you call him gruff, you call him angry. You are neither of those things in my dealings with you.
Yeah.
And I've heard other people who know you a lot better than I do say that you're not that kind of guy either.
Yeah.
Is that part of why you two were not as close as you might have been?
No, I don't think so. He was, you know, I say in the book that my dad taught me what to do, but my mother taught me how to do it. So my dad was a man of tremendous conviction, principle, and integrity, and not too eager to see the other side. My mother taught me how to work with people, how to find a way to make a connection, to get them on side, and to make some progress together. So it was that happy blend that I like to think ended up helping me be who I am.
I do want to take you back now to the conversation you had with your wife about why you should run. I guess we'll set the scene here. I know the story is that, you know, all the kids are sitting around and you know, who's going to run in Dad's place? And you say, well, we got a garage full of signs with my name on it, ha, ha, ha.
Yeah.
But really, why did you end up being the guy, given what a ridiculous proposition it was that you, no money, barely with a roof over your head, 4 kids, all young, a wife who didn't want you to do it.
Right.
How'd you end up being the guy?
Well, it was first of all, the issue was not whether a McGuinty was going to run. That was never the issue.
One of them was.
The issue was which one of us is going to run. We'd worked very hard on my dad's campaign and in his political life, and he'd built a foundation.
I guess we should say he was the Ottawa South MPP from 87 to 90.
Absolutely, yeah. So just timing worked out best for me. And it's funny that it was my brother David who originally expressed the keenest interest in running. But then it became obvious. He had children even younger than mine, and he was working with UNICEF in Abidjan, I think it was at the time. So it was really going to be very disruptive to his personal life. So it worked out, and Terry, as I say, was never a huge fan and doesn't remain a huge fan of politics, which was actually very helpful to me throughout because she was a good leveler. And her mind was at where the overwhelming majority of Ontarians were at. Leading busy lives, not overly engaged with or interested in politics. So that always kept me on kind of on a level playing field, you know.
But how'd you convince her at the end of the day that you ought to be allowed to do this?
Well, she just, I'm just lucky. I'm just lucky that, you know, we have such a wonderful relationship. We had, you know, she's my high school sweetheart. We had dated forever, and she knew how important this was to me. And because it was that important to me, and it wasn't some infatuation that I had with politics all of a sudden, this is the latest shiny object in my life. She knew that I was doing it out of a sense of obligation, a sense of responsibility.
I want to push a bit on this because the fact that she allowed you to do all this, and it turned into, let's remember, I mean, you run and you lose, okay, it's 6 months and it's over. But you ran and you won and you kept winning and I mean, this turned into
Nearly a quarter century.
Right, it was a 23-year thing for you.
Yeah.
And whatever career aspirations she had,
Yeah.
out the window.
Yeah.
So you know, do you ever wonder about the life, or does she ever wonder about the life she never got to have because you always had to come first?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I talk about this in the book as well, but when I consider all that she gave up in order to support me, and I think one of the challenges I had in my first campaign, among a few others, is she wasn't with me on the campaign bus. That made a huge difference to me. But of all the things that she gave up and all the sacrifices that she made and all the extra work that she did in order to accompany me and to support me throughout, I'm just humbled by it. I'm just kind of blown away by that kind of devotion.
I got to believe, though, there was a moment somewhere in that 23 years where she said to you, damn it all, Dalton, or does she call you Dalton? What does she call you?
She calls me Dalton.
She calls you, damn it all, Dalton, you know what I gave up so that you go off and play politics?
Sure.
You know, take out the garbage for God's sakes or something.
Yeah, from time to time that happens. It still happens, you know, because of you had to go into politics. Right. But I think that she'd also say we've gained a lot as a result of the experience that we shared together.
You say in the book, I have never wrestled with any tough issue without seeking and benefiting from Terry's insight. Give me an example.
Well, you know, she was a powerful motivator for me when it came to some of my school reforms.
Because she's a teacher?
She's a teacher, but full-day kindergarten in particular. Let me give you an example. And she's a teacher to this day. She would tell me that at the beginning of the year, some kids would come to school in kindergarten. Some were already reading at a grade 2 level. Others had never been held and read to. Books and reading were completely foreign to them. So they were coming in from a variety of different backgrounds and stages of readiness. So I knew that we needed to do a better job of helping get kids ready with a more formal learning that takes place beginning in grade 1. So that was a good example of how she helped me there. And then, of course, other times when I was struggling with, you know, a really tough thing for me was raising taxes in 2004. I mean, I was on the record in black and white as saying I wouldn't do that. And I hated doing that. And, you know, we can get into why that came about. You know,
we're gonna, don't worry.
Yeah, so, but Terry was there and kind of helped me do what I thought was right. Not easy, but right. And that was important to me.
I guess I'd ask the same question about your brothers, because although your brother David is a member of Parliament and has had a decent run in it, and now he's going to get to be on the governing side of the House of Commons, the fact that you were in as long as you were and had the kind of success you had, no doubt prevented them from having the kinds of careers they might have had. How did you kind of?
It's not just throwing a fence around some of their career opportunities, because they've always been very diligent, not trying to do anything that might compromise me and what I was trying to do. But there's all the usual stuff. So I've got, I think, you know, 24 nieces and nephews, all of my brothers and sisters-in-law, and they've had to endure the McGuinty product, right, which is conveniently bandied about in newscasts, cooler talk, water cooler talk, talk radio. Some of it good, some of it less than good, and they're wearing the McGuinty name.
But I think, for example, at some point I suspect David would like to have run for the leadership of the federal Liberal Party. And no doubt somebody came to him and said, forget it, your brother's the Premier of Ontario, they're not going to have two McGuintys, leading the two Liberal parties.
I'm sure, right? I'm sure that he's encountered those kinds of things. And other things, Steve, like when we adopted the HST, all right? Well, who were the next to have the election? I think it was the feds that went into the election. This was of no great benefit to the federal Liberal Party, or raising taxes in 2004. This again, or when I was on my horse and championing the elimination of the fiscal gap and trying to get more money out of Ottawa. Well, I can tell you Paul Martin did not embrace that warmly when he was Prime Minister at the time. So, but he's always understood that I've got to do what I have to do on behalf of Ontarians.
Same kind of question, though. Any of them ever come to you? I mean, Brendan, who, John Kennedy, when he was president, made his brother Bobby his Attorney General. You kind of had the same idea. You wanted to have your brother Brendan be your chief of staff when you first came in. Yeah. And then what hit the fan. And, did either of them at any point come to you and say, damn it, Dalton, we can't catch a break being your brother?
Absolutely. There were times when they could, and I could well understand that there was more negative in this for them in some ways than there were positives.
How do you make that up to them?
You don't.
Can't do it.
I can't do that. I'm just, eternally grateful to have their support and insights and guidance.
Okay, 1990, you're the one new Liberal MPP elected in what was otherwise a debacle for the Ontario Liberals.
Class of 1990, sitting right here with you today.
That's it. And you won't remember this, but I sure do. You and I had lunch shortly thereafter because I wanted to get to know the one new Liberal member. And during the course of that lunch, because of course David Peterson had lost not only the election but his own seat, and your party would be embroiled in a leadership convention soon, you actually mentioned in that lunch to me, I'm thinking I might want to run for the leadership of this party someday. And I remember thinking, this guy doesn't know where the bathroom is at Queen's Park yet. What the hell's he thinking? But you did, and you won. From 4th place on the first ballot and a worse 4th place on the second ballot. Have you ever in your life seen a screwier leadership convention than the one you won at 4:30 in the morning?
No, in terms of how long it took to arrive at the final result, and in terms of the bouncing around that I did that day. But I had worked long and hard to ensure that I would achieve some momentum there on the floor, Steve. I knew that nobody was going to win this thing in the first ballot. There were just too many of us going after it. So I spent a lot of time connecting with individual delegates and had a very simple pitch. I hear you're supporting so-and-so. I've got a lot of time for so-and-so. I hope that so-and-so does well. But let me tell you something. Should so-and-so fall off the ballot, I would be honored to have your support.
And that worked.
It did work.
You were a lot of people's second choice by the end of the night.
Yeah.
You were in this studio shortly after winning. And the weird thing is, you don't look a hell of a lot different. That was 1996. Yeah. Almost 20 years later, you don't look at the monitor over my shoulder. Let's roll that clip, please. I had many people today either call me or stop me on the street and say, who the hell is Dalton McGuinty?
Right.
So let me ask you, who the hell are you anyway? What do you want to tell people?
Well, I'm a fresh start for my party. I've got some background in politics. I've been there for 6 years. I have a family history of politics. My father had the seat before me. And I'm somebody who believes that politics is an honorable profession and that people working together can do good things. I also am a firm believer in liberal philosophies and values.
What do you think when you see that guy?
I don't know. It's hard. I guess I like my values and I like my idealism, Steve. And I think that one of the comments I make in the book, and I invite people to join politics, but don't look to politics to provide you with your values, right? And with your principles.
You better have them going in.
You better have them going in. And when I listened to myself in that clip, or I read my maiden speech, it was filled with a powerful sense of idealism, and you need that because it can be a corrosive atmosphere. It can rob you of your idealism. It can turn you into a cynic. And I don't think anybody wants to be led by a cynic. I think people prefer hope over fear and division any day.
In 1999, you had your first election as Ontario Liberal leader, and the Tories put ads on television saying you weren't up to the job.
Right.
And in this book, you admit that the guy we just saw in that clip
Yeah.
was not up to the job, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You weren't ready.
No, I wasn't ready. And it took an election for me to better understand that. And it wasn't so much that I didn't understand the issues. I didn't understand Ontarians. I didn't understand our economic and other kind of contexts. I didn't understand myself well enough at that point in time. And subsequent to that election, I became much more involved, for example, in the development of our policy. I knew that for me to be at my best as a salesman of our policy, I had to believe in it. And if I was going to believe in it, it couldn't be something that somebody handed down to me on a silver platter. I had to go out there and develop it. And then it was, when you bring conviction to the game, it's a pretty powerful differentiator.
At what point did you, so in 1999 when you ran, you thought, okay, I'm actually in my heart not up for the job or not ready for the job. At what point did you feel, I actually am prepared to be premier now?
You know, it's funny, after the debate, where I thought I didn't do that well, I felt liberated.
Which debate are we talking?
The first debate in 1999,
99,
leaders debate,
okay.
yeah. I felt liberated. I felt, you know, I think me winning this is now a long shot, so I've got nothing to lose. And so I kind of went for it. By going for it, I mean, you reveal more about yourself, you're less careful, you're not so concerned about making mistakes, about some kind of a gaffe. And you just go for it. So that was part of the learning experience for me. And then after the election, after I gained the support that I needed from my party to hang in there.
You won a review?
I won a review.
Yeah.
I convinced them that they should continue to invest in me. We're not going to throw away an election, and I will continue to invest in you. And then I began to do a bit of travel in the world, find ideas, put them together, grow stronger, invest in, put some work into developing my communication skills, all those kinds of things.
The funny thing about that election in '99 was you got 40% of the vote and came second. And Kathleen Wynne just won a majority government with less than that.
Yeah,
What'd she get, 38 and a half or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just how the votes shake out, right? And
Screwy, though.
she was just a much more efficient user of the votes than I was. But it was a good start, Steve. It was a great learning experience.
You come back 4 years later and you win in 2003.
Yeah.
How are you a different guy in '03 from the guy who ran in '99?
Well, I knew a lot more about myself, right? I knew more about the issues, obviously. I was a better communicator. I'd taken some training in that regard.
You went to Chicago.
I went to Chicago.
You saw David Axelrod, the guy who helped make Obama president.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you fired him.
And then we let him go, yeah.
What's the story there?
We got what we needed from him.
I see, okay.
We got what we needed from him.
Which was what?
Helping me be a stronger and more effective communicator. And this is kind of how it works. You're in the biz. You're a professional. And for people coming into politics for the first time, this element of communication is kind of a new thing. And this is how it kind of works. If you have good training, this is what I learned. The first thing they tell you is you need to sit in this kind of a way. The next thing they tell you is certain kinds of clothing is distracting. The next thing they tell you is you've got a mannerism that you don't know you have, but it really bugs people. The next thing they tell you is some of the language you use is hard to understand. The next thing they tell you is, you're using your hands too much.
I was going to ask, the stuff you're doing with your hands right now, did you learn that from him?
No. So, but the point is, you know where you end up? At your very best, you end up as yourself. You've removed the distractions, and then you're more able to be open to people, and when you're open to people, they're more open to you. So anyway, he was one of a number of individuals that helped me in that regard.
You tell us in the book that you and Stephen Harper never got along. You just weren't able to connect with him, even in private.
Right.
How come?
There's a, let me say this off the top. I'm grateful that Stephen Harper got into politics and devoted himself to public service. We need more people from all political stripes to do the very same kind of thing. I disagree strongly with many of the positions that he took. I always felt that my responsibility as Premier of Ontario was to establish a good working relationship with the Prime Minister of the day, regardless of his or her political stripe, right? We are politicians, but we're human beings first. And we hit the jackpot. We're living in Canada. It doesn't get any better. So we've got all kinds of room to find some common ground. But my problem with the Prime Minister Harper, was He's a very partisan guy, and he could never kind of set that aside. I found it very difficult to establish a connection. The other one was that, he was always kind of a guy, he never wanted me to forget that he was the prime minister and I was the premier.
How did he do that?
By, every once in a while, either through language or spoken or body language, that made it clear that this was a hierarchy and I was in the lower level, which I thought was unfortunate because I think Canadians expected that we would find something that we would have, that we could do together on the basis of some common interests, some common ground that we could build on.
Well, I do remember going to the press conference where you and he announced you were going to save the 2 auto manufacturers in Ontario.
Yes.
And, you can tell when there's sort of something going on between a couple of politicians.
Right.
And you can tell when there isn't.
Yeah.
And there wasn't.
Yeah.
Like, you guys got no karma at all.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
pretty evident.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I learned in your book that Mike Harris, with whom I would have assumed you had a horrible relationship,
Yeah.
actually called you on election night after he beat you and said,
Yeah.
hang in there, kid.
Yes. Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
that about?
Well, let me tell you about that, because not only did he do that for me, when Stephen Harper lost his first election, I phoned him, as I did all the federal leaders. I was then premier, and said, "Thanks for running. Thanks for your commitment to public service." I said, "By the way, you've just earned you've acquired a lot of experience," because he sounded very down at the time. And I think I said something to the effect of, "You don't want to throw that away." But that was a lesson I actually got from Mike Harris. Mike Harris phoned me and said, I've been there. I know what it's like.
And he had.
He had been there, right?
He'd lost before he won.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I hope to do with my book is to kind of break through that partisanship, which is unfortunately descended in Ontario, as it has throughout the country, the US and the UK, much of the Western world, into a poisonous state where it's compromising the public interest. But that was a good little insight. And I should tell you as well, Steve, that after the election, after my retirement, a couple of years later, Mike Harris and I were at a golf tournament. And so I saw him. I went and said hello to him. People were delighted to take some pictures of us together and all this. I said, Mike, people could be forgiven in the last election here in Ontario for thinking I was still the premier. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Because of all the attack ads you ran against this head." He says, "Now you know how I felt for 13 years. So we had a laugh about it, and he said, "If you ever want to have a beer, let's do that." And we did that.
You did.
And we did. And there's something that happens, ideally, when you remove yourself from the front lines, from active duty as a politician. You actually begin to see yourself as you see yourselves. Well, you see how much more you had in common than you understood at the time.
Okay, except that I remember a moment in the legislature where you were going at him pretty hard, and he came back at you and said, "If your father were alive today, he would be ashamed of the demonstration you've put on here today." Mm-hmm. Now that sort of violates one of the cardinal rules in politics, which is you don't bring family into it, right?
Right.
So I always wondered whether did you ever go up to him afterwards and say anything about that?
I didn't. And so what flows from that circumstance? I think, at our best, my job is to forgive and forget. His job is to understand what he did and to make sure he doesn't do it again.
Did he apologize?
No.
Did you want one?
Would have been nice, but you got to move on.
And you
right?
have?
You got to move on. I have, absolutely.
Because I remember at that moment thinking, these are two guys whose fathers were seminal influences in their lives.
Right.
Both fathers are dead. And, presumably you should have no attacks on dead fathers kind of an agreement.
Right.
But you didn't, obviously.
No, we didn't, yeah. It's funny, people ask me, who my most powerful influences were of a political nature. And one of the guys who fascinates me most was Nelson Mandela. Imprisoned for, I think, 25 or 26 years. Every right to come out embittered, he comes out ennobled. Yeah. To me, that's a pretty powerful example. So we're going to mix it up in the House. We're going to mix it up in partisan politics. But What do we do when we're at our best? I think we elevate ourselves a little bit rather than to fight fire with fire.
Okay, here comes my first, I know you're a hockey guy as opposed to a baseball guy, but here comes my first high fastball. I want to talk about your re-election run in 2007 against the man who is now the mayor of Toronto, John Tory, who was then leading the Conservatives. And he, of course, famously promised public funding for faith-based schools, which turned out to be a non-starter for so many Ontarians, and frankly, allowed you to win. You guys were tied in the middle of June, and then he came out with that, and the polls went like that. You went up and he went down. In hindsight, do you have any qualms about the kind of campaign you ran against him using that issue?
I'm not exactly familiar with the details of that, if you want to remind me of something specific, but I can tell you.
I can if you want.
Yeah, sure, why don't you do that? Yeah.
Okay. I remember you giving speeches saying, if we do this, meaning provide public funding to faith-based schools, there's a good chance that people of certain religious backgrounds will leave the public school system, and that won't be good for the public school system. Except that we already have a faith-based public school system in Ontario. It's the Catholic school system, which you're a product of, and I guess your wife taught it at some point? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So did anybody at any point say to you, holy cow, Dalton, this is pretty hypocritical to be running against public funding for faiths when we've already got it and you've benefited from it?
Right. Okay, so the existing system, I'm not claiming that the existing system is perfect, but it is what it is. It is what we have. It is protected under the Constitution. And my priority when it comes to education has not been to introduce some kind of constitutional disruption. It's been to reduce class sizes, get our test scores up, and we did by 15 points, get our graduation rates up, and we did by 15 points, and we raised our post-secondary education rate in Ontario, I think from 58 to 65%, which is the highest among the OECD countries. So what John was proposing was effectively the ghettoization of publicly funded education in Ontario. It would take a system which funds the public schools and the Catholic schools and divide that up into an endless number of microsystems based exclusively on faith. And I thought that would be a mistake. I think more importantly, Steve, so did Ontarians.
No, they clearly did. But I
think,
wonder, you gave a speech once, I remember this, at the Royal York, where you said, I want a public school system where the Jewish kids are sitting beside the Buddhist kids, and the Buddhist kids are sitting beside the Muslim kids, and the Muslim kids are sitting beside the Presbyterian kids.
And they are.
But ignoring the fact that the Catholic kids are all out over here in their own system.
I didn't ignore that. That's our constitutional reality, and the decision that I made is that I was not going to play around with that. I was going to focus on improving the quality of education for all our students.
You're only the second Catholic premier in Ontario history. First one was in 1867. So for all intents and purposes, you're the only Catholic premier we've known. Right. Did you ever mull defunding the separate school system and creating one unified school system?
No.
Because you could have done it.
Yeah.
A Catholic only Nixon could go to China, so only you could have done that.
Yeah.
You never mulled it over?
No. Too disruptive. Again, my focus was on improving the educational experience for our students.
Okay. Next election, 2011. You come up one seat short of a majority government on election night. Yeah. You'd have been the first guy since Leslie Frost in the 1950s to win 3 straight majorities. How ticked off were you on election night?
Well, first of all, I was honored to.
Yeah, I know.
No.
But seriously, one seat short.
I was honored to have won a 3rd mandate. Not something that's done very often. Would have been nice to have one more seat, but you've got to accept the outcome awarded you by the voters. So I was filled with a powerful sense of idealism. I said, I'm going to find a way to make this work. And I remember talking to Prime Minister Harper, in fact. He said, you're going to find it hard. And I said, what do you mean? He says, better to have the minority first and the majority after than to go from majority to minority.
He's right about that, isn't he?
He is right about that. And the other thing that I had was, of course, and I referenced this in the book, called Making a Difference, available at fine bookstores everywhere. I had an opposition that was sick and tired of me. I wasn't supposed to win in 2003 because I I wasn't up to the job. I wasn't supposed to win in 2007 because I'd raised taxes. I wasn't supposed to win in 2011 because I'd brought in the HST. And I was back again. So they were in no mood to make nice with a guy they'd been dying to get out of power for a long time. And now we found ourselves in a minority circumstance. So this was not what you call setting the table for success.
You pointed out already that the education system in the province of Ontario, by internationally judged standards, went way up under your tenure. Let's give you that.
We ended up in the top 5.
Yes, you did. And part of the reason that worked is because after teachers felt that they'd been picked on for 8 years by Mike Harris and Ernie Eves, you took a different approach. Part of it was financial, and part of it was, just sort of offering them more respect than they felt they'd had in the past. But then when the books got into trouble, you went to the teachers' unions and you said, I need your help. We got to freeze your pay because we're in deep doo-doo here financially. And their response was to kick you right in the you-know-what. And I wonder whether you came away with any conclusions about the advisability of spending all of those years trying to ingratiate is the wrong word, but certainly to make, to have a good constructive relationship with the teacher unions, when at the first sign of trouble, they were so out of there and on you like white on rice.
Yeah. I was disappointed. We had worked long and hard together. We had secured the first 4-year agreements. They were back-to-back, so we had secured peace. This was all about enhancing the quality of learning conditions for students. That's what this was all about. I had created something that was brand new to Ontario, the Premier's Awards for Teaching Excellence. I wanted to elevate teaching in the minds of Ontarians as a profession, which is incredibly important to all of us. There had been 8 successive years of pay raises. I had increased prep time away from the students to ensure that there's a better teaching experience available. I think I'd increased professional development time as well. So I thought I had done a lot. And the great thing was, Steve, we were getting results. It's one thing to hire 10,000 more teachers, as I did. It's one thing to build 600 new schools, as I did. It's another thing to introduce full-day kindergarten, as I did. But at the end of the day, you've got to get results that you can point to Ontarians. So as I said, test scores went up 15 points, graduation rates went up 15 points. So I was happy with the progress. But then we get, kicked in the head by a terrible economic recession. And it affected our books. And I needed to be able to call upon Ontarians, but especially my partners, my public sector partners. So I was disappointed when teachers didn't respond in the way I'd hoped they would. Now, eventually we got agreements with 2 of the federations, but we had to impose on 2 others.
You had to legislate. What's the lesson in all of that? I wouldn't change a thing that I did in terms of working hard to build a good working relationship with teachers. But you need to understand at the end of the day, they may not be there for you when you need them. And it just, it was kind of my continuing growth and maturation in real politic. And, it is what it is. And, I would have preferred, I think in some cases, different leadership in the federations to say, hey, you know what? I know that typically in the face of this kind of a demand from the government, we go to the barricades. But the truth of the matter is McGuinty's been really good to us, and we've worked really well together. And maybe we owe it to him, or maybe we owe it to the people of Ontario to take a pay freeze for a little while as we sort things out. The teacher union heads, and I don't say this in a pejorative way, but they're politicians like you were. Yeah. They get elected, right? They got a campaign.
Yeah.
Can you, and I know you would like to have heard that, but was it a bit naive for you to expect that a politician is willingly going to go to his members, the teachers, and say, we got to take one for Premier Dad here?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it's fair to say that I was naive. I think they ended up demonstrating that, and not just those leaders, but other labor leaders as well. Don't expect me to offer up something. Impose it.
They prefer that.
Impose it.
They prefer the hammer.
They prefer the hammer because they can turn to their people and say, hey, they're doing it to us.
Okay, your favorite...
I wish it was otherwise.
Sure.
Yeah.
Your favorite subject here. Let us acknowledge. What am I going to ask you about? What am I going to? Go ahead. What's your favorite subject in the whole world?
Gas plants.
You got it. Here we go. Let us acknowledge that 90% of the gas plants that your government cited happened without any controversy at all. There were willing communities to take those gas plants, and everything went tickety-boo. Would you, speaking of naivete, acknowledge that it may have been a tad naive on your part, in the dying days of an election campaign, to have canceled the Mississauga gas plant, assuming that people would take that decision on the merits and think there was no politics involved?
First of all, I wouldn't change what I did. And you're right, I should have been more alive to the cynical interpretation afforded to my decision, which is, by the way, was a decision that was made by the opposition parties. Let me say this as well.
You made the decision, but they agreed with it.
They agreed with it,
You were
yeah.
all on the same page.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I recall the Conservatives during the campaign saying, you can't trust McGuinty to shut down this gas plant. You can only trust us to do it. But the interesting thing, Steve, was that when these two gas plants became controversial, I was surprised to learn we had already built 18 other gas plants. You see, we had delegated authority to the Ontario Power Authority to build these new gas plants.
It's a neutral arm's length body.
A neutral arm's length body, yeah.
Supposedly removed from politics.
Removed from politics, theoretically, to help us replace some of the power that we had lost as a result of getting rid of our dirty coal-fired generation. So I discovered that we built 18 others in places like Toronto, Brampton, and Windsor. So it tells me there is a right way to locate these things and a wrong way to locate these things. These two were wrongly located. They were located in sites where I couldn't locate a single wind turbine. So we were going to build a gas plant, one of the biggest in North America, the size of a hospital, beside a hospital, right? So we got it wrong. And my responsibility, as I saw it, was to step in and make it right. The communities were adamantly opposed for all the right reasons. These two gas plants were relocated to communities that wanted them. Again, there's a right way and a wrong way to locate these gas plants.
Fair enough, but when you cancel a gas plant, even when the opposition parties share the same position on it, and you do it, I forget, was it 3 or 4 or 5 days before Election Day? You've got to expect that people are going to say, oh my God, you're not doing this on the merits, you're doing it to save some seats around Mississauga.
Yeah, but that's not how I operate, right? I had made a decision to relocate a gas plant in Oakville about a year earlier, right? Because I thought it was the right thing to do. So I remember when Brendan and Chris Morley came to see me on the bus and said, look, we got a big issue with this gas plant thing, right? And they knew that, and I described this in the book, for me to make a decision and be happy about it, I've got to do it because I think it's the right thing to do. So I brought the same thinking to bear in the heat of an election for the Mississauga gas plant that I did in the cool, dry atmosphere a year earlier before we were in an election when it came to the Oakville gas plant. It was wrongly located. My responsibility was to rightly locate it.
Okay,
that's why I did that.
The next problem after that, though, was that somehow it got out there that canceling this contract to build the Mississauga gas plant was only going to cost $40 million.
Right.
And as we see from further studies, and the Auditor General has had her look at it and so on and so forth, I mean, who knows? It'll be 20 years before we really find out what the total cost was, but the estimates now are around $1 billion,
right,
which is a long way from $40 million.
Yes.
Which, when those two numbers came out,
right,
people said, why the hell is McGuinty lying to us about
right,
this?
Right. And I talk about this at some length in the book as well. So two things that we should have done, that I should have done when it came to the gas plant issue. Number one is, it's one thing to create agencies like eHealth, Orange, and the OPA, and say, go out there and do your stuff. But at the end of the day, nobody knows who the head of the OPA is, or Orange, or eHealth.
They know you.
But they know this head.
Yeah, they do.
Right? And if something goes wrong, they want this head. I should have paid closer attention to what it was that the OPA was doing so that I could head off any obvious problems before they became expensive propositions. That's issue number one. I should have been on top of that. Number two, when it came to costing, it quickly became apparent to me, not only did we not have the capacity inside my office to cost this thing, it's a very complicated thing, We did not have the capacity inside the government to cost these things within the Ministry of Energy. So the first number that I got was $40 million. And I said, I remember a very good conversation with my staff. I said, I'm not going out there and saying $40 million if we're not absolutely confident that this is $40 million. Oh no, we got it from the energy experts. So I went out and gave the number. Ultimately, it took the provincial auditor to come in with a costing. And again, that's only projected. It's an estimate as to what it would cost over the course of some 20 years to relocate and supply the electricity from that location all the way to the intended destination. So not the best government on my part. I acknowledge that. I regret that it came out that way. But Steve, my motivation for making the decision is as strong today. I would do that if that were in your riding or anybody else's riding, for that matter.
You've used the same words just now that you used when this happened. Acknowledge, regret. You know that there were people who wanted you to apologize. You've never used that word.
Right.
How come?
Right. Well, I'm not going to apologize for doing what I think is right. The gas plants were wrongly located. It was right for me to move them.
Kathleen Wynne was in that chair and used the word apologize 11 times. Let me read the quote. Here we go. This is from your book. It was a mistake for me to delegate decisions to locate gas plants to the energy experts. While it's true the experts got 18 out of 20 right, those last two more than establish why I should have kept this responsibility inside my government. I take full responsibility for this failing, and I deeply regret this. I also regret that my successor, Premier Kathleen Wynne, and her government had to spend so much time on this issue. She came here to the studio. She apologized 11 times for it. As she was walking out of the studio after the cameras were off, she looked at me and she said, I hate this issue. And who can blame her? My question is, did you at any point in any of this worry that you had passed on a poisoned chalice to her?
I knew that I had created a challenge, but you know, Steve, I have an abiding faith in Ontarians. And I thought that had I been advising the opposition parties, as I say again in my book, I would have said, folks, you're overplaying your hand. We're talking about gas plants that you lobbied the government to shut down. And now you are engaging in fabricated outrage that is clearly over the top. So for about a year, my successor had to contend with this real challenge. And they say every dog has its day, and during that year the opposition had its day, but on election day Ontarians had their say. And they decided that they were going to re-elect a Liberal government. They were going to elect for the first time a Premier Wynne government. And to me that speaks volumes about placing this in context. Was there any deliberate malfeasance on the part of anyone here? No. Was there a failure to provide oversight to a newly created government agency? Absolutely. Did we lack the capacity to come up with the numbers? Did we kind of fumble and juggle in a embarrassing way for some time? Yes, we did. But I think at the end of the day, Ontarians placed it in context. It was hardly our finest hour, but it was not something that was worthy of capital punishment.
But it was serious enough that you felt you had to leave the country for a year after your time as Premier was up.
Yeah.
You went to Harvard. You really
Yes.
got out of Dodge.
Yeah. Well, I disagree with that characterization, but let me tell you, let's talk about this for a minute. I tell the story just at the outset. I tell the story how after I'd finished law school, I came home and I said to Terry, honey, I want to go to medical school. She said, we got 2 kids, get a job, which was, of course, good sense. So I'd always wanted to go back to school. And as you may know, my dad studied at Harvard, so that's another reason I wanted to go there. So it turns out my plans weren't denied me, they were only delayed when it came to going back to school. So I always wanted to go back to school. Now let's talk about my exit from politics, right? I think it was Lyndon Johnson who said, politics is like a hammock, hard to get into, even harder to get out of.
That's a good line.
There are 3 ways you can get out, right? You can die in office, as my father did. You can be defeated, as Prime Minister Harper was, or you can get out on your own terms. I had a number of terms that I attached to my exit from politics. One of those, and this is an important test of leadership, and Prime Minister Harper was in breach of this particular aspect of leadership, is item number 10 in my last chapter. Leaders know when to leave You've got to know when to get out, right? So one of the conditions I attached was, I need to get out in a way that gives my successor a fighting chance to win the next election. In part, right, leaders, political leaders, are the liver of the party. You absorb toxins. The longer you're there, the more poisons you're going to pick up. And if you're doing your job at the end, you will remove yourself in such a way as to give your successor a fresh opportunity with a fresh face and a fresh agenda.
Which you did.
Which I did. How many, you ask yourself now, right? Take a look at those who preceded me. Take a look at the federal government. Who's won 3 in a row and then left a circumstance such that there was a fighting chance for their successor to win a 4th? So I did my job. I won my 3. I removed myself from politics. Yes, I did go to Harvard, but that is something I've been longing to do for a long time. And I gave my successor a great chance. And she sees that, and you know, I give her all the credit for running a great campaign, for being a person of integrity, and for making difficult decisions and always doing what she feels is right.
I want to ask you about something that you actually don't talk about in the book, and that is, who did you want to replace you? There are a bunch of good candidates who ran. Who did you want to replace you?
You know, I didn't have a choice there.
Well, you did. You were a delegate of the convention.
No, I was not a delegate. I'm not a delegate. I'm a what do you call it?
Ex officio?
Ex officio.
Yeah. So did you not vote?
I voted, and I'm not going to tell you who I voted for.
I really want to know that.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. But I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what I'm proud of. Mm-hmm. Everybody who ran sat at my table. Many of those I recruited personally into politics. I want you to think of the party and the way it was in 1996. We had no money, we had no momentum, we had no winning record, we had no prospects, and we had no faith in ourselves. When I got out in 2011, I would argue we had, if not the winningest political machine in the country, the second winningest political machine in the country. We had lots of money, we had lots of policy, and we had a stable of potential successors that were, it was a great bench, right? Lots of strength there. So I'm proud that we had a good contest. I'm proud that of everything that Premier Wynne has done, and she has my full support.
She's done something in the last federal election campaign very differently from what you did. Mm-hmm. I mean, you kept your head down. I think you did some door knocking for your brother, obviously, because you guys shared a riding. But otherwise, you did not go out there and do what she did, which I think was about 20 events for Justin Trudeau.
Right.
You did not do events for Paul Martin or Stéphane Dion or Michael Ignatieff, that kind of thing. Was it wise for her to dive in so deep?
Well, let me say this at the outset. The most that any predecessor, I feel, can ask of their successor, because otherwise you're going to drive yourself crazy. I wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have done that, or I wouldn't have done it that way, is that they be true to themselves and do what they think is right. And Premier Wynne does that every single day. Now, would I have done what she did? No, I didn't, but I want her to do what she feels she needs to do, because I would have been concerned about, well, what if the other guy wins?
Yeah.
I've got to work with that guy. But I can only conclude that she felt that things could not have gotten any worse. She took a bit of a gamble, and it paid off. Well, I think there's going to be I think there's going to be a great working relationship now between Premier Wynne and Prime Minister Trudeau.
A lot of pressure there.
Lots of pressure.
A lot of pressure to come through.
A lot of pressure.
Don't come through.
A lot of pressure to deliver. But just as there's pressure to come through, there's a foundation of goodwill and understanding.
I've known you for 25 years. It's hard to believe, but I actually have. So I know you are not a cynical person. But I want to ask you this. Are you concerned, the achievements that you've talked about in this interview notwithstanding, that the public's cynicism about politics is bigger because Dalton McGuinty was premier, because he raised taxes in 2004 when he swore he wouldn't do it, because of the gas plant business, because of Orange, because of e-health? Are you worried cynicism is worse, not better, because of you?
No.
Why aren't you?
I'll tell you why. Because of the lasting positive things that we were able to do together. I'll give you an example, right? So we've got 265,000 children who are and full-day kindergarten every day as a result of changes that we made together here in Ontario. I think we found family doctors for 2.1 million more Ontarians. We made a land grab for future generations. I think it's 1.2 million acres, the GTA Greenbelt. It's the biggest urban greenbelt in the world. We have found a way to get ahead of the curve when it comes to tackling climate change by shutting down our coal-fired plants and building a renewable energy sector. That's great news for Prime Minister Trudeau when he goes to Paris, right? Guess who did the heaviest lifting in the country when it comes to reducing carbon emissions? In North America, Ontarians.
And Harper took credit for it at a leaders' debate.
On a regular basis.
You like
yeah,
that?
He did. Yeah, I loved it. But there are those other elements. That's true. But I think people will see the big picture. I think that people want to be fair about themselves. This wasn't just my legacy; it's our legacy. It's what did we do in Ontario between 2003 and 2013. We didn't run a perfect government, Steve, but I think when it comes to the big things, we did those well and we got them right.
Let me ask you one last question. What do you miss?
I miss the camaraderie. I miss the team environment, and I miss the privilege of being in a position where you're actually shaping the future through public policy. That's a very stimulating, intoxicating environment, and I miss that a lot.
How long did it take you to come down from not picking up the paper every day saying, oh, problem, I'm going to go fix that today?
It takes a while. In some ways, I'm still suffering withdrawal. You know, you go from 100 miles an hour to a dead stop. As soon as you announce that you're leaving, people start looking over your shoulder. That's in the natural order of things. That's how it works in politics, and it's hard to let go. It's a real privilege, and there's nothing quite like it.
That's Dalton James Patrick McGuinty Jr., 24th Premier of the province of Ontario. His new book is called Making a Difference. Good of you to visit us at TVO tonight.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.